The rain fell in sheets that turned the trail into a river of mud, and every step the wagon wheel took sounded like a groan of protest against the earth. Eleanor clutched her trunk with white knuckles, the single chest that held all her dresses, her mother's comb, and the contract that promised her to a man she had never met. When the driver pulled up near a lopsided cabin at the far edge of the settlement, he didn't help her down, only jerked his chin toward the door and muttered that her husband-to-be was inside. Eleanor slid from the wagon, the hem of her dress already plastered with mud, and by the time she reached the porch, her bonnet was dripping heavy drops onto her shoulders. She lifted her hand, hesitated, then knocked. Silence. No shuffle of boots, no voice calling out. She knocked again, harder, the storm answering her with a clap of thunder that rattled the shutters. At last the door cracked open, and in that narrow space she saw him, broad-shouldered, face shadowed with a beard that looked more like neglect than pride, eyes hollow like he hadn't slept in days. He didn't greet her, didn't even say her name, though surely he knew it. He just stared, then stepped back enough for her to enter. Eleanor's boots squeaked on the wooden floor, and she caught the sour smell of whiskey, stale bread, and a man who had stopped caring about the shape of his days. The room was bare save for a table, a broken chair, and a bed that sagged under the weight of blankets that looked untouched. She opened her mouth to introduce herself, but the words caught. His eyes slid past her as if she were no more than another shadow carried in by the storm. He muttered something low, the kind of sound that could have been a name but wasn't, and then he turned his back on her and sat heavily on the bed. Eleanor stood frozen in the doorway, soaked through, her trunk at her feet, her heart slamming against her ribs. She had crossed states and given up everything familiar for this silence. This man too broken to speak the name of the woman sent to him. She tried once more, her voice trembling as she said she was here, that she was ready to keep her vows, that she hoped he would keep his. His shoulders rose and fell with no answer, and then the sound of his breathing deepened like he had slipped back into a restless half-sleep. Eleanor pressed her lips together, holding back the sting in her eyes. She thought of her father's last words before she boarded the train. Make yourself useful. Don't expect kindness. She had told herself she would be strong, but standing in that silent cabin, with rain hammering the roof and her presence unnoticed, she felt as small as she had ever felt in her life. Slowly, carefully, she turned the latch, stepped back outside, and closed the door behind her. The storm swallowed her whole again, cold wind slicing across her cheeks, mud sucking at her boots. She pulled her trunk against the wall of the cabin, sat on it, and wrapped her arms around herself, rocking slightly as the night deepened. She whispered into the rain, telling herself she would not cry, she would not beg. Yet as lightning split the sky, she pressed her forehead to her knees and prayed she hadn't stepped into a life that would strip her down to nothing. The storm dragged through the night, pounding its fury against the cabin as if to test how much the wood and the woman outside could endure. Eleanor's arms ached from hugging herself so tightly, and her dress clung heavy as a second skin, wet and cold enough to make her teeth chatter uncontrollably. She told herself to be still, to wait until morning, to prove to this silent man inside that she could endure whatever he threw her way. Yet when her eyes closed for even a moment, her body tipped sideways and she nearly slid from the trunk where she perched. The door behind her creaked suddenly. Eleanor jerked upright, blinking through the rain. At first she thought the storm had rattled it loose, but then a shape filled the frame, a dark bulk haloed in lantern light. He stood there, staring down at her, one hand braced on the door frame, his hair hanging loose and damp, his face unreadable except for the faint lines of weariness carved deep into it. For a long moment, Neither of them spoke. Then his voice came, rough as gravel and unpracticed from disuse. "You're still here." Eleanor stiffened, trying to sound steadier than she felt. "Where else should I be? You didn't want me inside." He flinched, as if the truth had struck like the rain itself. He shifted his weight, eyes sliding past her again, then back. His jaw worked, but no words followed. Finally, with a sigh that seemed dragged from the bottom of him, he reached down, not to touch her, but to lift the trunk she sat on. He carried it back into the cabin without asking, without looking at her, and set it down near the hearth. Eleanor blinked in surprise, her body torn between relief and defiance. She followed slowly, dripping water onto the wood floor as she stepped across the threshold she had been denied hours earlier. The fire in the hearth had long gone cold, just a heap of ash and char. Without speaking, the man crouched, arranged kindling, and coaxed a flame to life, his hands steady despite the weariness etched into every line of him. Eleanor watched the sparks catch, light spilling across his features, and in that glow she saw not cruelty, but a man carved down to almost nothing. She dared ask his name aloud, though she already knew it from the papers: Daniel. This time he didn't look away. His gaze met hers, dark and searching, as though he wanted to be certain she understood the weight he carried. He nodded once, a reluctant acknowledgement. Daniel. Then, just as quickly, his eyes fell again, and he pulled a blanket from the bed. He didn't drape it around her shoulders. Instead, he held it out like an offering he couldn't explain. "Take it." His voice cracked on the words, but it was the first true kindness he had shown. Eleanor accepted it, wrapping the scratchy wool tight around her, and as the warmth seeped slowly back into her bones, she dared hope that maybe the man who couldn't speak her name might still find a way to speak something else. Daniel sat down on the floor by the fire, back against the wall, silent again. Eleanor remained on the trunk, blanket tight, eyes fixed on him, wondering what wound had silenced him so completely, and how long before it might turn its weight on her. Eleanor barely slept, half from cold and half from the uneasy quiet inside the cabin. The storm outside had thinned to a drizzle, but in here, every crackle of the fire and every shift of the man beside it pressed against her nerves. Daniel hadn't moved from his spot against the wall, legs stretched out, head tipped forward as though he might doze but never quite let himself. The blanket around her held more than warmth. It held questions she didn't dare voice until the silence became unbearable. She spoke softly, careful not to startle him. "Why didn't you want me here?" The words hovered, fragile, almost lost in the hiss of wet logs. Daniel didn't answer, not right away. His hands opened and closed against his knees as though he fought something inside. Finally his voice came, low and broken. "Because I can't say her name." Eleanor frowned. "Whose?" He lifted his head then, eyes dark as char, fixed not on her, but the space above the fire where smoke curled upward. "My wife. She died 2 winters ago." The word wife left his mouth like a blade, dulled from use, but still sharp enough to cut him. Eleanor's chest tightened. The sting of grief she hadn't known was his clamping down on her ribs. She had come all this way, answering letters that promised a future, only to find herself standing in the shadow of another woman's ghost. Daniel rubbed at his face with both hands, fingers trembling. She died in that bed. She died calling my name. And when they wrote me about a bride, about you, I thought maybe I could. His voice caught, and he shook his head hard, as though finishing the thought would splinter him completely. Eleanor felt her throat close. She could see it all now. The broken man too hollow to let another step through his door, clinging to silence because it was the only thing left that still belonged to the woman he'd lost. She swallowed, her own heart twisting, but she steadied her voice. "You don't have to say my name yet. Just let me stay." Daniel's eyes snapped to hers, and for the first time she saw them truly alive, fierce, wounded, refusing and pleading all at once. His jaw clenched. He looked away quickly, but his silence now felt different, less a wall and more a thread pulled taut, waiting to break. Eleanor tightened the blanket around her and slid from the trunk to the floor, inching closer to the fire. She didn't touch him, didn't dare. But she placed herself within the circle of warmth that belonged to him. The storm outside had faded to mist, but in here the air carried something heavier, something that promised every step forward would demand a price. She sat in the glow beside him until her eyes burned from the effort to stay awake. Before sleep claimed her, she heard him whisper. Not her name, not yet, but something that curled through her chest like the faintest ember of hope. "Stay," he breathed, as though the word itself was permission he'd been denying for too long. And when she finally closed her eyes, Eleanor knew that whatever storm had carried her here was only the beginning. Eleanor woke to the sound of hooves outside, not the heavy rhythm of a rider, but the uneven skitter of something young. She pushed herself up, the blanket falling from her shoulders, and caught Daniel already standing at the door, rifle in hand, though his stance was more habit than threat. He cracked the door open to the wet dawn, and pale light poured across his face. Beyond the cabin's stoop, a colt stood in the clearing, ribs showing, mane plastered by rain. It pawed at the earth as though searching for its mother, head jerking nervously toward the trees. Eleanor's breath caught. The creature looked like she had felt only hours ago, lost, trembling, waiting for a hand to drive it away. Daniel lowered the rifle slowly, jaw working. "Stray," he muttered, but his voice carried the hesitation of a man who saw more than a horse. The colt whinnied, high-pitched and sharp, and Eleanor flinched at the sound. She wrapped the blanket tighter and stepped beside him. "Don't send it off," she whispered. He glanced at her, frown deepening. "You think it'll live out here alone?" Eleanor's throat tightened. "Number. But maybe that's why it's here." She didn't mean to sound like she was talking about both of them, yet when his gaze lingered, she knew he heard it anyway. Daniel leaned the rifle against the doorframe, shoulders heavy as if surrendering to something he'd fought too long. He stepped onto the porch, boots sinking into the soft mud, and crouched low, arm outstretched. The colt froze, ears flicking, legs trembling. Eleanor held her breath. The little animal stomped once, then inched closer, drawn by something in Daniel's stillness. When its muzzle touched his hand, he closed his eyes. A shudder ran through him, quick and sharp, before he rose again and led the colt toward the shed. Eleanor followed, silent, heart pounding. Inside the dim shed, Daniel scattered hay from a half-rotted bale, his movements mechanical, almost desperate, as if keeping the animal alive was an argument he needed to win with himself. Eleanor reached out and smoothed the colt's damp neck, its skin twitching under her touch, and she felt tears gather unbidden. She hadn't cried since she left home, hadn't allowed herself the weakness, but now it came hot and sudden. Daniel noticed. His voice was rough, uncertain. "Why tears?" Eleanor shook her head, brushing them away. "Because it came here. Because it stayed." He studied her, silent, and for a heartbeat she feared she'd said too much. But his expression shifted, some of the iron giving way, and he muttered, maybe it was meant to. The words landed heavy between them. The colt pressed against Eleanor's side as though claiming her, its small body warm despite the rain still dripping from its mane. She bent, wrapping her arms around it without thinking, and for the first time since she'd stepped off the stagecoach, she felt something anchor her. When she looked up, Daniel wasn't watching the colt at all. He was watching her, lips parted as though her presence itself unsettled him more than the storm ever had. His eyes dropped quickly, his hands tightening on the shed's rail. He turned away, but the set of his shoulders betrayed a battle no rifle could solve. Eleanor held the colt close, heart pounding with the sudden certainty that she had stepped into a place where survival wasn't just about food and shelter. It was about whether either of them could let another soul stay. And by the way Daniel's breath hitched in the silence, she knew the hardest fight had only begun. The fire snapped loud that evening, louder than it needed to, every pop echoing the silence Daniel refused to fill. Eleanor sat near the hearth, knees drawn beneath her borrowed skirt, the colt asleep just outside the cabin wall where its faint rustling carried through the boards. She stitched a tear in her sleeve by the firelight, hands steady though her chest felt like a drum. Daniel sat opposite, sharpening his knife with long, deliberate strokes, the steel whispering against stone. The air between them was charged, too heavy to ignore. She had endured silence before, her father's kind, her neighbor's, but Daniel's silence was different. It wasn't disdain, it was fear pressed flat into quiet. Finally, Eleanor broke. "You can't keep me here like a guest forever," she said, her voice a low tremor. His hand paused mid-stroke, knife gleaming in the fire's glow. He set it down, lifted his gaze, and for the first time didn't look away. "You think you belong here?" The words weren't cruel, but they cut all the same. Eleanor lifted her chin. "I know what it means to work, to scrape by. I wouldn't have come if I didn't." He shook his head, eyes narrowing, though something in them flickered. Recognition, maybe. "I've seen promises like that before. Folks who swore they'd stay, only to leave when the land bit back. You'll be no different." The dismissal sparked heat in her chest. She set her sewing aside, leaned forward, and her voice rose before she could temper it. "You think pain is yours alone. You think silence makes you strong." She pushed a hand against her breastbone, where her heart pounded raw. "I came here with nothing but a name and hope that someone, anyone, would see me as more than a burden. And now you tell me I'll leave? Maybe you're the one who already has." His jaw clenched, and for a long moment he didn't move. The firelight carved the lines of his face into shadows, and she could almost hear the walls he'd built groan under her words. He rose abruptly, pacing to the window where the storm clouds pressed thick against the glass. His shoulders were rigid, fists balled at his sides. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked, a fracture in the iron. "I buried more than a wife out here. I buried the man I was supposed to be." Eleanor stood too, her own anger cooling into something steadier, sharper. She stepped closer, her voice dropping. "Maybe that man isn't dead. Maybe he's just waiting for someone stubborn enough not to run when he growls." Daniel turned, and for the briefest instant, vulnerability broke across his face like dawn breaking through cloud. He looked at her as though she had reached into a place he'd sworn no one could touch again. But then his walls slammed back, and his voice hardened. "You don't know what you're asking." Eleanor squared her shoulders. "I know exactly. I'm asking to stay." The colt outside stirred, nickering softly, its sound threading into the tense air as if siding with her. Daniel flinched at the sound, his gaze flicking toward the wall where the animal pressed close. His chest rose and fell, and he muttered something under his breath Eleanor couldn't catch. The fire popped again, startling them both, but this time neither looked away. The fight hadn't ended. It had only just begun. The storm broke at dawn, leaving the world washed in gray silence, but inside the cabin the tension still smoldered like coals refusing to die. Eleanor folded the patched sleeve carefully, placed it in her bag, and tied the string with trembling hands. Her mind replayed every word from the night before, each one cutting sharper in the morning light. She had faced rejection before, but Daniel's felt like exile after she had already crossed the threshold. He hadn't spoken a word since, only moved about like a shadow, feeding the colt, stoking the fire, setting tools in order with mechanical precision. It was as though her presence had cracked something, and now he was scrambling to bury it deeper. Eleanor straightened, heart hammering against her ribs. "I won't beg to stay," she whispered, almost to herself. She lifted the strap of her bag onto her shoulder and moved towards the door, her fingers brushing the latch. Behind her, the scrape of Daniel's chair on wood made her freeze. "Where do you think you're going?" His voice was low, raw. Eleanor kept her eyes forward. "You were right. You don't need me. I won't force myself where I'm not wanted." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Then came the sound of boots striking wood, his steps quick, deliberate. His hand caught the doorframe just as she pulled it open, the cold air rushing in, carrying the smell of damp earth and pine. He stood too close, his breath uneven. "You think walking away proves something?" His tone carried no anger, only desperation that startled her more than any shout could have. She turned then, her eyes flashing against his. "It proves I won't stay where I'm nothing but a ghost in your silence." Daniel flinched, his grip tightening on the frame. He seemed on the verge of saying more, but the sharp whinny of the colt outside shattered the moment. Both of them turned to see the young horse pacing near the hitching post, head tossing, nostrils flaring. Its agitation wasn't from hunger or cold. It was fear. In the distance, faint but distinct, came the echo of hooves on wet ground. More than one. Eleanor's breath caught. Riders. Daniel's expression darkened instantly, shifting from broken man to wary sentinel. He pushed the door wide, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle propped against the wall. "Stay inside," he ordered, his voice iron now. Eleanor clutched her bag tighter, torn between retreat and the compulsion to follow. She had only just threatened to leave, but the sight of him framed against the gray sky, rifle in hand, made her realize how foolish her words had been. She wasn't walking away from an empty man. She was standing at the edge of a storm that hadn't even begun. Daniel glanced back at her, his jaw hard, but his eyes held something that hadn't been there before. A flicker of need. Not for pity, not for rescue, for someone to stand witness. "Don't open that door again unless it's me," he muttered, then stepped out into the wet dawn. The colt pressed against Eleanor's skirts, as if begging her to hold steady. She rested her hand on its trembling neck, listening as the hoofbeats drew closer, heavy and relentless, the promise of conflict riding on their thunder. The bag slipped from her shoulder, forgotten at her feet. She wasn't leaving anymore. The hoofbeats grew louder until they filled the valley like a drum roll of doom, and Eleanor pressed her palm harder against the colt's neck, feeling its shiver echo in her bones. Daniel stepped into the clearing with his rifle slung low, boots sinking into the wet earth, his shoulders squared, though his breath came ragged in the damp air. The riders crested the ridge in a cluster, 5 shadows against the pale morning light, their ponchos dripping rainwater, their horses blowing steam. They slowed as they reached the cabin, fanning into a loose half-circle, eyes sharp, hands resting easy on gun belts. One man dismounted, tall and whip-thin, a scar pulling his mouth into a sneer even at rest. "Thought you buried yourself deep enough to hide, Daniel," he said, his voice carrying across the sodden yard like a crow's caw. "But trouble's got longer legs than you think." Eleanor gripped the doorframe from inside, her heart hammering. She wanted to run to him, but his last order still rang in her head. "Don't open that door unless it's me." Daniel's jaw tightened, the years of silence clinging to him like chains. But for the first time she saw him fight against them. "You've got no business here, Redden," he muttered, the name like ash in his mouth. Redden chuckled darkly. "No business? You walked away from our deal. You left my brother bleeding in that canyon. Men don't forget debts like that." Daniel's silence deepened, but Eleanor saw the tremor in his hands, the way his fingers flexed against the rifle. He wasn't just facing enemies, he was staring down ghosts. Redden's eyes flicked towards the door. "And who's that shadow inside? Another soul caught in your mess?" He tilted his head. "Come on out, miss. Let's see if he told you what he really is." Eleanor's breath hitched, and before she could stop herself, the colt pushed past her into the yard, its wet mane plastered, hooves squelching in the mud. It planted itself beside Daniel, head high despite its trembling. The riders laughed, mocking. A horse for a shield? Figures. But Eleanor saw the way Daniel's shoulders eased, the way his free hand brushed the colt's neck as if drawing courage from its fragile defiance. He finally spoke, his voice breaking but firm. "She's got nothing to do with this." Redden smirked. "Then it's her bad luck she chose you." He raised his hand in a lazy signal, and two of the men shifted in their saddles, spurs jangling. Eleanor couldn't stand it. She shoved the door open and stepped into the wet morning, the cold biting her skin, her heart beating louder than the horse's snorts. "If you want someone to blame, take me," she shouted, her voice raw but steady. "I came here by choice. Leave him be." The words cracked the air, and for a second, silence clung heavy. Daniel turned to her, eyes wide with a mix of fury and awe. Redden's sneer deepened, but he didn't laugh this time. "Brave," he muttered. "Foolish, but brave." He looked back at Daniel. "Seems you found yourself a woman who speaks louder than you ever did." Daniel's throat worked as though he were swallowing rocks. Then his voice came low, rough, but clearer than she had ever heard. "She's not yours to speak of. She's mine to protect." Eleanor's breath caught as the colt pawed the ground, echoing the defiance in his words. The riders shifted uneasily, sensing the shift in him. Redden's smirk faltered. The storm between them had only just begun. The standoff stretched, rain dripping from the eaves of the cabin, every drop a countdown that no one dared answer. Redden's men shifted in their saddles, leather creaking, fingers brushing the iron at their hips. Daniel's rifle hung steady in his grip, but Eleanor saw the strain in his jaw, the tension crawling up his throat like a snake. The colt pressed closer to his side, shivering but unflinching, its dark eyes wide as though it knew this was the moment its fragile courage might break or hold. "Speak your piece," Redden said at last, spitting into the mud. "You've been a ghost too long. Say it, or we'll drag it out of you in blood." Daniel's chest rose, then faltered. His silence had been his armor, his penance. But with Eleanor standing bare in the rain and the colt beside him, his shield of quiet was crumbling. He drew a breath so sharp it cut the morning air. "Your brother died because he wanted blood," Daniel said, the words rough, each one scraped from the inside of his ribs. He ambushed settlers, women, children. I told him to stop. He laughed. He raised his gun. "So I fired first." Redden's eyes darkened, his sneer trembling on the edge of something savage. "You admit it, then? My blood on your hands." Daniel shook his head, rain tracing down his beard. "Number his choices killed him. I buried him with my own hands. That's the truth I couldn't speak. Not to you, not to anyone." Eleanor's breath hitched. She realized then his silence hadn't been cowardice, but grief knotted too deep for words. Redden's men glanced between each other, the weight of Daniel's confession shifting the ground beneath them. Yet Redden only snarled, his rage feeding on itself. "Truth don't change a debt." He snapped his hand down, and steel flashed as his men drew. The air cracked with tension, Eleanor's scream stuck in her throat. The colt reared suddenly, its shrill cry tearing through the yard as its hooves lashed the mud. The sudden movement startled the nearest rider's horse, which sidestepped hard, nearly unseating its master. In that split second of chaos, Daniel lifted his rifle, his voice booming louder than thunder. "Enough." His shout froze them all, not with the barrel of his gun but with the sound, clear, strong, undeniable. The man who had hidden in silence now commanded the space with nothing but his voice. Eleanor felt her knees weaken, her heart swell. She had prayed he would speak, prayed his truth would cut chains, and now it rang out like a church bell across the wet earth. Redden's horse shifted under him, sensing his fury, but even he hesitated, unsettled by the sudden force of Daniel's presence. The other riders' hands twitched at their holsters, but none moved first. Eleanor stepped closer to Daniel, mud sucking at her boots. Her fingers brushed the back of his arm, steadying him, anchoring him. "We're not afraid of you," she said, her voice shaking but sharp as glass. The colt snorted, stamping, as if punctuating her words. Daniel lowered the rifle a fraction, but his eyes never left Redden's. "You ride out now," he said, his voice iron, "and you leave her, the colt, and me in peace, or you test whether you walk away whole." The storm had shifted. It was no longer Daniel who seemed cornered, but Redden, faced with a man who had finally laid down silence for fire. And the fire was spreading. The rain slowed to a mist, the air heavy, every breath thick with gunpowder waiting to be born. Redden's eyes gleamed like a wolf's at the edge of the firelight, but now it was Daniel who burned hotter. Eleanor felt it, his silence broken, his strength rooted not in violence alone, but in truth finally spoken aloud. Still, truth rarely turned away vengeance. Redden twitched his fingers once, a subtle command, and the first rider jerked his revolver free. The shot cracked like lightning, tearing open the sky. Eleanor screamed as the bullet slammed into the post inches from her head, splinters biting her cheek. Daniel's rifle boomed back a heartbeat later, the kick hammering his shoulder. The rider who had fired reeled backward, his hat spinning into the mud. Horses shrieked, stamping in a frenzy, the yard erupting into chaos. The colt bolted toward Eleanor, brushing its wet flank against her side as if shielding her. She clutched its mane, crouching low, the heat of the frightened animal grounding her even as men fired and shouted. Daniel moved like the storm itself, every step sure despite the flying lead, his rifle reloaded with the speed of old practice. His face was carved from stone, but his eyes burned with something new. Resolve, not just survival. Redden spurred his horse forward, pistol raised high. He wanted Daniel's blood, wanted it before his men lost heart. Their leader's charge cut through the bedlam, and for a moment all sound seemed to narrow to hooves striking wet earth and the harsh cry of a man consumed by rage. Daniel raised his rifle, aimed steady despite the rain slicking his hands. But just as he squeezed the trigger, Eleanor screamed his name. A second rider had flanked him from the side, revolver aimed at his ribs. Daniel fired and Redden's horse screamed, stumbling hard, but in that instant the side rider's shot cracked out. Daniel staggered. The world tilted. Eleanor's heart seized as she saw his rifle fall, his body lurching as though dragged down by the weight of every ghost he'd carried. She ran without thinking, mud clinging to her skirts, the colt pressed against her side, following her into the storm of men and guns. Daniel hit his knees, one hand clutching his side, blood dark in the rain. Still he forced himself to lift his head, his lips shaping words that sounded like prayer and defiance all at once. Not again. Not while she's here. He drew the revolver from his belt, firing upward into the chest of the rider who had shot him. The man pitched backward with a cry, his body tumbling into the mud. Smoke and screams twisted through the rain. Redden rose from the muck where his horse had thrown him, mud streaking his face, his pistol still in hand. His eyes locked on Daniel and Eleanor like a predator scenting blood. "No more speeches," he snarled, raising the gun. Eleanor flung herself in front of Daniel, arms out, the Colt stamping at her side as if it too would shield him. "If you kill him, you kill me!" she shouted, her voice raw and shaking, but cutting through the chaos like steel. The men hesitated again, horses snorting, guns wavering. Redden's hand trembled, his fury clawing against something deeper, uncertainty. Daniel, bloodied but unbroken, lifted his revolver once more, eyes steady despite the red soaking his shirt. "Then let's finish this," he rasped. The yard was fire and rain and silence, all waiting for the next shot that would decide whose world ended here. The silence before the final shot was heavier than the storm itself, every raindrop pausing mid-fall as if the earth itself braced for the end. Redden's pistol glistened, his knuckles white, his chest rising like a bellows about to explode. Eleanor's breath came fast, but she did not move. She stood firm, skirts clinging to her legs, arms stretched as a shield over Daniel, the Colt pressed warm against her hip. Daniel swayed where he knelt, one hand still clamped to his bleeding side, the revolver steady in the other, eyes locked with the man he had dreaded facing for years. For the first time, his silence was gone. His voice had been heard, and now only one thing remained: to end it. Redden snarled, spittle mixing with rain. "You took my brother. I'll take everything else." His finger twitched on the trigger. Daniel's revolver thundered first. The shot cracked through the yard like the strike of judgment, and Redden staggered backward, shock wide in his eyes as the gun slipped from his hand. His knees buckled, the mud swallowing him as he fell heavy, his rage broken, his breath gone. For a moment, the men on horseback froze, the war drained out of them by the sight of their leader crumpled in the rain. Some shifted as if ready to fire again, but Daniel rose then, slow, bloodied, unbowed. His voice rang out over the storm, hard and final. "It's done. He's gone. Ride or join him." None challenged. One by one the riders pulled their reins, turning their horses away. Rain softened their retreat, hooves fading until only the sound of breath and storm remained. Eleanor dropped to Daniel's side, catching his arm as his strength faltered. "Don't you dare close your eyes," she whispered fiercely, though tears blurred her sight. "You've carried too much alone. You don't get to leave me now." The Colt pressed close, nickering softly, its warmth anchoring them both in that fragile space between life and loss. Daniel looked at her, his lips trembling into the ghost of a smile. "You gave me a voice again," he rasped. "Don't let me lose it." She shook her head, pressing her forehead to his. Not a chance. With effort that seemed to break him and rebuild him all at once, he let her help him inside the cabin, collapsing into the chair by the fire. She tore cloth for bandages, her hands steady even as tears fell, binding the wound with a tenderness that matched the ferocity of her spirit. Hours passed, the storm easing into quiet, the fire crackling low. At last, Daniel reached out, his rough palm covering her hand where it rested on his chest. His voice was weak but certain. "You saved me. You and that Colt." Eleanor turned, the Colt standing just beyond the open door, head lowered, eyes watching with the calm of something more than animal, as if it knew its place in this story. Maybe it had been meant to carry truth to their door all along. By dawn, the rain had washed the yard clean, and light spilled across the cabin. Daniel slept, his breathing deep, his hand still locked around hers. Eleanor rose, stepping outside. The colt nudged her shoulder, and she pressed her cheek to its wet mane. "We'll heal him," she whispered, her voice steady now. "We'll build something whole." Behind her, the cabin glowed, no longer a place of silence and ghosts, but of voices found, and futures waiting. And with the first break of sun, Eleanor knew the West would remember not the violence of the night, but the redemption carved out of fire, blood, and love that refused to yield.